Hey team, good morning. It's minus 10 here this morning. It's nothing crazy, but we're going to start a fire in the tiny home. I've been doing this for years, as has anybody who's been running a wood stove. Unfortunately for me, about 15 years ago, I started to engage in the field of engineering, and then the laws of thermo and fluid and every other dynamics became part of my life. So this nerd who graduates ends up now reanalyzing their entire life and that process and how they participate in it. So I'm going to show you how a senior engineer lights a fire, which is not to say it's the best, but it definitely reflects some thought. Okay. So I'm going to switch this around. What I've done here is I've got Canadian Tire newspaper, and what I do is I take the full leaf and I kind of loosely crumple and fold it in half, and then I give it a firm twist in the middle. And what that does is it gives me really fluffy light ends that light, but also a bit of a denser center that can hold kind of a slower burn and help that kindling get where it needs to. I grew up making balls. I found them just to be too long and time consuming. This is really, really fast to do, is to make these dog bones. And then if you actually sort of line up the dense sections in the middle, you can overlap them quite well and make a really nice paper bed that has a ton of like burning potential in that. You know, every fire start, guys, every fire start is a function of what you have available to you. So super short story, way deep in the wilderness with a friend fishing, late November, a high altitude rainstorm comes in. It's freezing cold. It's not freezing, but it's freezing cold. And we don't have sun or anything to get warm. We get to the shore and we take off this whole half sort of circle of birch bark. We start the fire underneath that. So it's shedding the falling water. We start the fire underneath that. And then what we do is we start feeding it pine needles. So a high oil based fuel. It burns through the top. We had already built on top a bunch of pine branches. So by the time it burnt through, it had enough momentum, so to speak, to take over that whole fire. And we just kept feeding it high oil because the oil is going to outburn the water, essentially, right? So it's always a function of what you have in your circumstance. So going back to the wood stove. In this case, I've got newspaper. You could have birch bark. You could have virtually nothing and feather out your kindling and go from there. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, if you know your Tinder process, you know what you're getting into. So when it comes to the kindling stack, I don't do a teepee. I find that if you want to do that sort of Finlandish style fire, the wood needs to be very close for the vertical burn to be effective. So I find the teepee to be ineffective. And then what'll happen is all the pieces will kind of fall over and they'll make this very poorly organized pickup sticks waffle pattern that I think is kind of ineffective and really not that great. Now, maybe I'm wrong. You guys might think different. Like I said, this is all me, and you can take from it what you will. So what I've done here is I put in insulating wood. So there's fire brick already in the wood stove. That's fine and dandy. And this will slow down how fast the firebox warms up, which changes how much heat you get out of it and so on and so forth. But it sets up your fire for greater success. So I've done this again out in the late fall and taken wet wood and built an entire firebox out of wet wood. And I'll do this in the winter too, when the wood's cold, and it'll warm up. You got to understand, wood auto ignites. Correct me, it's like 300 degrees or something like that. It auto ignites. So when you've got wood baking, not only is it drying, but it eventually reaches auto ignition. And this wet wood that is deflecting heat wherever you need it is also drying, not detracting from your fire, and then later going to contribute ultimately to your burn. So I put in a couple pieces just to kind of isolate my fire start. This is a nice vertical burn face. This is just going to heat up and kind of roll over eventually. So whatever, you work with what you got. Don't overthink it. But this is a great way to help you. And this could be in the field. You might be in the middle of the forest. You might be working in a wood stove like this. I've just learned to do the same thing all the time. And I really don't have any trouble. Now, if your kindling is hardwood, you're going to have more trouble. Anytime you're having trouble, smaller pieces, smaller pieces, smaller pieces. If you have a giant piece of bone-dry, kiln-dried cedar, you could probably light it with a match at the bottom, and that would work. So it's always a function of what you have available. Today, I've got some old kind of dry poplar that isn't the best, but it's a softwood, and I've used it before, so I'm semi-confident in it. I've got some stickers from some milled lumber, which is probably pine or spruce or something like that. So that's going to go okay on top, but then underneath, I have this beautiful cedar. So I know I've got a good paper bed, nice insulating walls, perfect cedar, okay pine, and okay spruce. So this is going to go just fine for me today. So I'm going to stop because it's getting long already, and I'm going to build it and show you the aftermath. Okay, so I'm back. I've made my structure, and we're just about ready to light it. What I want to show you here is that you're actually building a structure. You're thinking that flame wants to climb. Once it's burned something, you have an ash ember that falls, and then it keeps its retained heat and burning to kind of contribute to what will be the coal bed, but ultimately something that will burn from below. Again, you get that temperature up, things auto-ignite. So I'm a huge fan of building structures to fail. That's essentially what this is. Let's take a look. So the paper is the same. I do a grid pattern with my kindling if I have enough. I like to offset one row on top of the gap of the other. It doesn't always work out. You go small, medium, large for sure. I put in a diagonal guy here just to help support my structure coming up. You can see I've got my small, my medium, and then my largest, and then for some reason I tucked in these small or medium guys on top. Well, why not? Once the flame reaches that, you know, it's just going to drop down, land on that thing, help burn that, so on and so forth. Heat rises, you got to get the smoke out, but you also want to insulate that fire so that you're essentially making like a little thermal ignition blanket with enough oxygen. Remember your fire triangle. So essentially here what I'm saying is I don't want to block the breathers, but I want to make sure that I've got enough room to really let this thing go off. And it's cold today, so that cold air is going to want to push down on the flue, chimney and flue, and I'm going to need to get the heat out. So I'm going to run this with the door kind of cracked and let this do its thing, and it'll work out okay. I've got no worries about that. Temperature of wood. So I'm coming in here with freezing cold wood, minus 10 degree wood all across the board. That's going to make it more tricky. If you have warm wood, man, you're going to do way better. So at the end of the day, this is going to work. Let's take a peek here in a few minutes at how it all kind of burned down. Okay, still here. So I've had the door cracked now for what's probably like 3 minutes, and I just want to give you a quick update on how this whole thing's unfolding. And I also want to touch on a bit of a topic that we didn't cover, which is trying to add oxygen to a fire, which can sometimes be your saving grace, and that could be for a variety of reasons, but I mean, hey, you got to have a spark, you have to have fuel, you got to have oxygen. So anyways, let's check this out. So right now, the tinder is basically gone, right? The kindling lit up. The frozen mid-size took a little while, but the flame is finally reaching the large. Now, if you look up, that medium again is taking a lot of flame, which means it's going to drop down and contribute to the whole picture, which is kind of fun and cool. Also, look at the tall wall on my insulating board. Just burning like crazy. Not only is it a total close heat deflection, but it's working. There's moisture in it, though. It's being driven out, but it's not detracting from the fire any more than the cold fire brick would. In fact, it's contributing because as that heat drives the water out, it still has a combustion face. And the same thing is happening down there. So you see how you can use less than ideal wood or hardwood that doesn't take well to starting a fire as a fuel source. Now, when it comes to adding oxygen, you can do it a bunch of different ways. You can do the method, just keep blowing, which is exhausting, and you're probably going to take some mouthfuls of smoke along the way and so on. So you can do the like, process. Yeah, all right, it works. I've used a shovel in the past. For this rental, what I actually bought was a small little USB rechargeable fan, just thinking that maybe people who are less experienced with fires might find themselves in a bind more often. And basically you get a bit of a cold coal bed, but you know there's something there. You hit it with this little fan for a little while. You just wait, and it'll start. The black will turn to kind of a pink, that'll turn to a red, that'll turn to an orange, and so on and so forth, and it'll light right up. If you're outside, a really fun one's a leaf blower. Like that'll really put it down. But know this, if your wood's wet or green, the leaf blower will blow off the burning layer that hasn't had enough time to transfer its heat to the green, wet, rotten, whatever layer inside. So it doesn't work with wood that doesn't have the ability to burn readily. Okay, so see here, kindling's pretty much gone now. The top's going to want to start to collapse, and this introduces a bit of a problem where I've supported my members on the side, which from a structural standpoint is a good thing. That means this building wouldn't fail. Well, I'm sure it would fail, but it would take a lot longer, which is a good thing. But I need that wood to be in contact with what's on the bottom.
So I can either stick in a couple other pieces, or I can open this up in a minute or two and just kind of pull these, and they'll shuffle and collapse down, and then I'll put more on top and the whole process continues. But ultimately, you've got a kick and fire. That's been the crack. There's really no smoke coming out. It did a bit when it started. And at the end of the day, follow this and you're going to really up your fire starting skills.
Thanks for watching. Thanks for being a part of this rental. If you're coming to this rental, if not, it's just good information. And yeah, stay warm, stay cozy.